And this brings us to mistake number 2. It's titled zone number 2 is not magic. I would even say maybe no zone is magic. But we focus here on zone number 2 because it gained a lot of attention in the media lately, especially as being the magic or one-size-fits-all training zone. Okay, and with that, I have to admit, and I learned that Reinhold is the same or with his athletes, also in the federation. I personally stopped using training zones actually more than a decade ago. But training zones have their right to be here and have their advantages. And one advantage is obviously, especially if the zone is narrow, you can try to target specific training adaptation. And what is an upside and what is a downside is the second point here, that it can actually help with communication. But it only helps with communication if you and your athlete who you're communicating with are on exactly the same page and understanding which training zone you mean. It can get actually a problem. It's a downside. It can be very confusing if you're talking to athletes or coaches of other sports. Because especially when you deviate from a 3-zone model, a 5-zone model or a 6 or 7 or whatever, they can be entirely different, and they actually are entirely different in different sports and or in different countries. So zone 2 in cycling in, for example, Germany is something totally different than zone 2 in triathlon in Germany. It might be something totally different than zone 2 in skiing in the US, right? Just to give an example. So that's something, theoretically it should help us communication, but more in a direct communication with an athlete and not so much across sports. Something to be aware of. To dive a little bit deeper into the zones model in terms of physiological background, the 3-zone model is basically very simplifying, so to speak, everything up to the fat max zone, which is marked green here, right? Where you have, which you can see in the underlying blue graph, and a tremendously higher ability to combust lactate, to combust fuel than you produce lactate. And then the heavy intensity domain, which is everything from this fat max middle intensity up to threshold, which is the yellow part here. And then what is nice, I think, about this 3-zone model is that it just lumps up everything above threshold into one zone, which it's not very accurate, obviously, but the beauty of it is that basically, every intensity above maximum lactate steady state will sooner or later result in exhaustion and result in normally should result in VO2 max. So therefore, it has its upside to do it this way. How does this look like in the training zone? So I brought a slide here from our training zone builder, where you can build any training zone that you want and look at the physiological conditions. So here we would have zone 1, and we would have a target zone, and you can see a range, big problem, so to speak, right? You can see the range. As we see in the previous slide, basically goes from 50 watts up to, in this case, professional cyclists, up to 218. So huge range. This is why I just mentioned I personally don't use training zones. I just prescribe the exact power numbers I want to see. Then the zone 2, again, especially in cycling, in this professional athlete, a very big range, almost approximately 140 watts. And then just everything above maximum lactate steady state, in this case, everything above 400 watts is one zone. Right, so that's basically how it looks like, and of course, it's a very, very rough model, maybe suited more for non-elite athletes. Zone 5 model, if you look closer, it's similar. Basically, what it does, it breaks up this huge zone number 1 into 2 zones, which is beneficial, right? Because just let me jump back here. Let's say if I prescribe a training and say, hey, please ride 3 hours at zone 1, and the athlete rides at 50 watts or 277 watts, obviously is a big difference in training load, right? Remember the slide Reinhold showed about the training load being time multiplied with intensity. So it's too rough, right? It's too rough if it's not accurate enough, not precise enough, if I would just write the zone. And this is where zone 5 helps a little bit by narrowing down the zone so that I actually don't need to write a power output, but I could actually write a zone because it's maybe just a range of 30 or 40 watts. And the same goes for the upper zone. The upper zone above maximal lactate steady state is split up in zone number 5 and zone number 4. What is a little bit unlucky is this anaerobic label it carries, because, going back to the previous slide, you can see that lactate production always goes up. So basically, the higher you go, the more anaerobic energy contribution there is. And to draw, a line in the sand and say from here it's anaerobic, it's a little bit difficult. Anyway, this is how the zones do look like. Now let's get to a practical example here, and we are comparing professional athlete in the preparation phase, so in the off season and in the season. Off season being the dashed line, season being the solid line. You can see the metabolic profile on the left-hand side here, a little bit lighter in the season, 70 versus 71 kilograms, a little bit higher VO2 max and a little bit lower VLA. So what you can see here is that how that zone shifts, right? If you, for example, look at the fat max, which is the apex of this green curve, or solid line, right? It got shifted up by approximately 50. It is highly dependent, obviously, on the actual training status, and it changes, during the year, during the preparation. However, from a practical perspective, you are necessarily adapting that zone precisely by that 50 watts, right? In practice, not necessarily happening. What is maybe more important to notice, and I will show you the difference that becomes more important to an amateur athlete, actually, or non-professional athlete, looking at the energy consumption needs for that, and also the utilization, for example, of VO2 max. So energy consumption needs, so this goes back to this previous slide, right? So now we're looking at the numbers from this metabolic profile. And what you can see is that the carbohydrate oxidation, so the energy demand of carbohydrates, did not go up quite a lot, right? 81 grams to 83 grams. Fat combustion went up tremendously, right? However, what changed quite significantly by 10% is the utilization of the VO2 max. And this is quite important and quite interesting, because if you look into the literature, you will find that the percentage of VO2 max you use at training, even though we don't prescribe training like this, the percentage you use of VO2 max is commonly accepted as a good indicator of what the aerobic adaptation might be. So you could argue that you define a zone based on fat max, zone number 2, which is the magic bullet currently in the media for training, or often sold like or communicate like this. But in the preparation phase versus in the season, the utilization of VO2 max is different by 10%. So you could argue that in the preparation phase, the athlete was not getting the adequate stimulus in terms of percentage use of VO2 max. And out of these things, if you've heard something like reverse periodization, where people train higher intensity in the winter, this is one reason why this came up, right? To account for that and actually have sessions where you increase intensity. So important to watch for, important to look out for. Something, again, you can do with the training zone builder to really see what is my VO2 max utilization in these efforts. And this brings us to something which is even more drastic, or I think should ring an alarm here, should flag this here. This is compared now an amateur cyclist, body weight 71 kilograms, so very similar to our elite cyclist. We just very, very good VO2 max, 65 milliliters, and an average VLM max of 0. And we use in comparison the elite cyclist we just had for in the season profile. And now look at the differences in VO2 max utilization. So for your amateur athlete, the VO2 max utilization is now 20% lower. So you could argue again, using VO2max as an indicator for your aerobic training stimulus, you could argue, hey, wait a second, this is 10% less stimulus based on what is commonly used in the literature. So remember, 15 minutes ago, what Reinhold presented, that the literature shows us that different training models are both successful. That's part of the answer right here, right? That's part of the answer right here, because you can see that this zone 2 training in a higher trained cyclist and a higher trained endurance athlete has a bigger VO2max stimulus than in a lower train. And you could extrapolate that to somebody with a VO2max of 45 milliliters, for example. And this is why it's so important when you look at training zones to look at these actual stimulus, actually look, okay, how much of my VO2max I'm actually using in this zone. You get at least a rough idea on what is actually my aerobic training stimulus. So recommendations to sum this up. Training zones can help us increase the understanding of appropriate training intensity. However, again, in terms of communication, be careful and ensure that you're on the same page what you mean with training zone, right? What we've seen very strongly is that determining a training zone like zone 2 based on fat max, so determining it based on substrate utilization, elicits different training adaptations based on different metabolic profiles. So fat max for athlete A and fat max for athlete B means they are both at fat max, does not mean they get the same aerobic training stimulus. Okay. Both zone 3 and zone 5 models are good for especially beginner athletes. It's especially easy also for the communication. However, you need to make sure that, for example, in the 3-zone model, you're more precise with prescribing the intensity. And yes, the threshold training intensities not be considered as optimal training intensities. That takes us with a grain of salt, because I have seen a few very successful athletes, and when I say very successful, I mean world champions, who had success with a lot of threshold training, but it's more outliers, so to speak, right? So this is why it's under recommendations. Take it with a grain of salt, but I would, let's say, it's not a general recommendation, right? And I think we have another comment on that you should not extrapolate from what some elite athletes are doing to what, that making it general recipe for everybody.